is Risper Onyango. I'm going to be your moderator for this particular panel, and we are going to be looking at the changing face of consumer protection in Africa's digital economy. So joining me, I have Vellah, I have Jorge, and I have Dixon, who are going to be helping us go through this conversation, and I'm going to give them a chance to introduce themselves. But before that, maybe I'll just give you a bit of context about who we are. So we work with the Lawyers Hub, which is based and headquartered in Kenya, Nairobi, and we focus on digital policy and tech innovation, particularly with the Global South. And so we lead discussions when it comes to emerging issues within the digital economy as relates to digital policy. And so it's exciting to be part of the conference and the conversations that are happening in this regard. And so I think one of the things that we try to do is to make sure that the African context isn't left out of the conversation, because, that has been recurring, whereby we get the end result of, decisions or products. And so we are not really participating actively when it comes to the very first point of interaction. And so we do hope that with such discussions, we'll have more Africans in the room who are engaging on these issues, because it definitely directly affects them. And so the nature of our conversation is going to, start with a presentation just to look at where the continent is at as relates to consumer protection, the different regulations and the different discussions happening. And then we will now invite our panelists, that is Vellah and Jorge, to kind of give us the two different perspectives. So one, with regard to competition law and consumer protection, and then secondly, with regard to emerging tech and how that potentially affects consumers and the interaction online. And so I think to kick us off, I will invite Dixon to spearhead the conversation with a bit of a presentation, which is going to be projected shortly on the screens. And then thereafter, we can come back into the room and have a bit of a discussion around this particular topic. So Dixon, are you able to hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so just introduce yourself and take us through the presentation.
Thank you, Risper, for the wonderful presentation. I'm Dixon Shem, Ogugu, lawyer and also an advocate trainee at the Kenya School of Law. So today I'll be actually taking you through the overview of the consumer protection in Africa and the state at which we are as a continent. So to start us off, I'd like to mention about our organization, the Lawyers Hub, which is headquartered in Kenya and serves the Global South, majorly Sub-Saharan Africa, and it works to advise on digital policy and justice on an Pan-African basis by providing innovative and technological-driven solutions to policy and legal practices. Our main actually pillars are one, digital policy, two, digital economy, three is justice innovation, and lastly, research, learning, and publication. The Lawyers Hub has annual convenings, which are the African Legal Innovation Week on Justice Innovation, and also the annual Africa Law Tech Festival, which is up on July this year here in Nairobi, Kenya. So to start us off about consumer protection, I would like to just go straight to saying that consumer protection is a shield that protects online consumers and mostly consumers in this digital market outside ecosystem. So basically, consumer protection protects consumers and ensures transparency, accountability, and trust in the digital age. So to say more on it is that consumer protection actually has the following five or six things that it has to safeguard. Number one is the safeguarded treatment and of consumers, fair treatment of consumers in the online ecosystem. It also tries to actually ensure that the consumers' rights are protected in the online ecosystem, and also aims to prevent fraud practices and protect privacy in the ecosystem. And also it tries to provide a platform and an environment for easy online transactions. That's basically what consumer protection is. It's a shield that protects consumers in general trade, and for us in our context, it actually protects consumers in the digital ecosystem and online transactions. So a report done by International Finance Corporation and Google actually showed that the online internet economy in Africa has a potential to reach at around $150 billion by 2025, with a potential that is actually accounts to 5.2% of our continent's GDP, which is a high rate, which if we implement the online and digital age issues, then we'll be at a higher rate of the economy. So by 2050, it's projected that the internet ecosystem economy will actually have a potential of $712 billion GDP, which is around 8.5% of the African continent's GDP. So you can see that the internet economy is actually a nice ecosystem that has a lot of potential in the continent. So looking at the tools that actually work on and ensure that the digital economy works in Africa, we go straight to what we call the internet, where the internet penetration in Africa is at a steady growing pace with almost 100% penetration in Morocco, which is the highest country with the highest penetration, which is actually about 82.2% penetration rate, with the slowest being Somalia, which I can tell is because of the insecurities and issues to do with the fiber cables that are yet to penetrate that particular country. But the internet penetration in Africa is growing at a very steady rate. So by 2030 or 2050, we will be having almost close to 100 of many of our countries' internet penetration. And also going to the number of users in the internet in Africa, we will see that online sales in Africa are growing year in, year out, with actually a 25% rate growth per year. As of 2020, the number of digital buyers in Africa amounted to around 387.5 million. That is the number of internet buyers in Africa. The number is actually expected to increase compared to which is actually increased compared to 2017. By 2017, we had 139 million. But now in 2022, we had around 387.5 million in digital buyers in Africa. Now, these are the people that the consumer protection laws are supposed to protect. These buyers who transact online mostly. And as you can see, the growth is at around 25% increase. We have Africa having around 600 million, over a billion people. We'll see that there is a growing rate of 25%. We are projecting with this rate of since 2017 to 2022. By 2027, we'll have 600 million consumers in Africa, online consumers alone. So these laws for consumer protection are very vital to protect these people from any harm when they're transacting online, which is the new digital ecosystem that is traversing the African continent. So other statistics, we can see that the penetration rate of e-commerce, one of the pillars of online transaction, is at 80% in Morocco, which I had mentioned that it has the highest rate of internet penetration, meaning the internet use there is very high, making it have the highest penetration rate of e-commerce. So meaning once a country has the highest internet penetration, e-commerce rate in that particular country is actually very high, with Egypt at 39% and Morocco at 51.9%. Mauritius is at around 14% penetration of the e-commerce ecosystem in that particular country. Generally, Africa has 31.6% in e-commerce penetration. Expected to have a 44% penetration by 2027. At around 2050, will be at around 80%, owing to the rate of growth we are experiencing for the last 5-6 years. So the internet use, as you can see on your screen, the yellow and the blue one. The yellow one shows the internet users in 2023, which is growing, as I have just mentioned, internet use grows at around 25% year in, year out. With online cellular mobile connections, where Africa has the growing rate of mobile use because of the growing rate of internet, we have more youths in the continent. With the more youths, we have more use of the mobile phones, the gadgets, which actually now leads us to now going to the online ecosystem. Now these internet users and the youths and all the people that are traversing the internet for trade, these are the people that the consumer protection laws, data protection laws are trying to protect from any malicious harm they can experience in those particular transactions. So in your slides, you can see that we have the e-commerce consumer protection support tools that support the e-commerce ecosystem in Africa. The first one that you have mentioned is the internet and enabled devices like the mobile phones, the gadgets, the tablets that the consumers use when traversing the internet. We also have electricity, which is also a challenge in Africa, where most people in Africa don't have access to electricity, and those that have the electricity is around not reliable most of the time. We also have payment methods and delivery logistics. That is the payment methods like M-Pesa, eCash, where we use now, instead of using cash, we use the online payment methods. We also have the e-commerce platforms, which I'm going to show you in our next slide. And also we have data, because without data, then you cannot service the internet mostly. So personal data, products data, and delivery data, this is one of the biggest tools that we use in the e-commerce ecosystem. So going to our next slide, where we now has the platforms that we use in the e-commerce and the digital ecosystem. Jumia is highly used in Africa with 23 million per month transactions, and also users in Africa. With Takealot, a South African company which has at around 10.5 million visits, and also Amazon. These are the e-commerce platforms that we have. So going by the journeys that we have in the online transaction, the journey that a consumer has in the transaction is number one, the awareness stage. This particular stage, where now you take your phone and then you start now traversing the online transaction, seeing what you can buy, what you want to buy. So this awareness stage has different risks where there is a lot of privacy breaches and data breaches. Because Nigeria was recorded the highest rate of online search and breaches in 2022. Or in 2023, the first quarter, that's from January to April, with 64% data breach. That is 82,000 accounts were compromised in that particular area. Globally, we had around 41.6 million breaches of the internet. So that's very high risks that people have in the internet. We also have phishing scams that we have around 8.7 of them in Africa percent, with South Africa having 9.7% and Kenya having 8.4% pursuant to the number of internet users. So the percentage of the phishing scams is also high, and that's why we need the consumer protection to protect the consumers from these particular scams, the malware, viruses, the online frauds that we experience in the online transaction, and the misleading and false informations, false advertisements. These are the challenges that the consumers face at the awareness stage. Now, taking your phone, just going to traverse the internet to check and see which product you can buy. Now, once you have noted the products, am I going to Jumia? There's a place now, the stage where we call the consideration stage. Where I've just seen, I've seen these products. Now, let me consider buying them. So the challenge here now is misleading product information, where you find a product it says it's quality and it's this particular rate, yet it's not that particular rate. It's misleading. Unreliable reviews and ratings, where each product has ratings. Now there you find it has over 5 ratings, and yet there are unreliable reviews and ratings. Also hidden fees and deceptive pricing. You can find online, it's around $4. Then when you buy when you reach the buying stage, you find it's now $10. That's hidden fees. There's also what we call limited product availability, impulse buying, and also false advertisements, and as I've just mentioned. Other risks that that consumers experience online is payment fraud that I've mentioned, also delivery and delayed delivery, where you order for something, you don't see it eventually, or you order for something, it comes after a month or two after the need is also is not there. So there's a poor customer service. When you call them, they don't pick sometimes, or they actually don't even, they act rude, because you cannot meet face-to-face like in the traditional trading. Also data breaches I've just mentioned, overcharging. I've just also mentioned that one, incorrect product specifications. I've also mentioned that one. Also applying, ordering for something, then you get something that is not the exact thing that you ordered. That's also the consumer risk that we face online, that our consumers that we have mentioned, around 600 million consumers in Africa face. So once these risks have been noted, like I've just said, there are policies in Africa still that govern these particular risks. We have the cybersecurity laws, we have data protection laws that protects our data in African continent. We also have electronic transaction laws that govern the transactions electronically. We also have the consumer protection laws, which sometimes mention, in some countries mention issues to do with online transactions. The state of online consumer protection in Africa at the moment is not at a good view, but you can see this progress, where we have 25 of 54 countries having the data protection laws, consumer protection rights, and electronic transaction laws, with only 4 having drafts. We also have, between 2019 and 2022, nearly 10 African countries enacted laws affirming data privacy and data protection. So it's between that rate, we can see between 2019, 2020, 2022, we have 10 African countries having data protection laws. That's a growth rate that is recommendable, and we commend most African continents to actually develop these particular laws for data protection. We have 33 countries that have forms of legislation of data protection and privacy protection as of 2021. Yeah, that's a nice indication that data protection is actually a core value in the African governments, and they're trying to legislate that those particular laws into acts. We also have regional blocks that have safeguard data protection. We have the Malaba Convention, which is yet to be law, but it only has remaining with one country, which is once the country ratifies, then the Malaba Convention starts to work. And I saw the president of Kenya saying that he will actually ratify that particular law. So once it's ratified by the 15th country, then the Malaba Convention for data protection and cross-border transfer will actually help in the online will help consumers in the online ecosystem. So looking at our map, as I finish, we can see the maps there. You can see the blue one has the blue part has those countries that have the data protection laws. There are around 33 of them. The red one has they have no laws. There are very few, and the others have draft registrations. So, like I mentioned, African countries are working tirelessly towards ensuring their citizens are protected online. This actually a plus in Africa, where now we are seeing more and more people traversing the internet for protection. So we also have cybersecurity laws and electronic laws, where some few countries have laws, others don't have laws, but others, majority of them have drafts that are yet to be law. So there are parliament bills that are being discussed to see if they fit that particular country, because these laws must also fit that particular country culture and also the people centered. So these bills are in parliament in most of these African countries, trying to see if they can actually help these consumers traverse the ecosystem and help the economy at large. Lastly, you can see there a table. The table is an analysis of Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa and Egypt. So Kenya has a Consumer Protection Act, the same as Nigeria, the same as South Africa, the same as Egypt. The two have the consumer protection laws. The scope of those particular protection laws in Kenya, it offers general consumer protection provisions that cover online transactions. The same applies to Nigeria, which actually also covers unfair trade practices, product defects. The South African one also covers issues to do with fraud, unsafe products, and misleading representation in online transactions. And the Egypt one also covers consumer protection, misleading advertisements, and provisions of defective products. Online resolutions, where there is an issue to do with online fraud or online misleading information. This act, the Kenyan Act, does not specify specifically address online dispute resolution mechanism. The Kenyan Act, the Nigerian Act mentioned, the Nigerian Consumer Protection Council is actually responsible for dispute resolution, either online or physical. In South Africa has the National Consumer Commission, which handles consumer complaints and disputes, including those arising from online transactions. Also, Egypt has the Consumer Protection Agency. This agency actually holds consumer complaints and mediates between consumers and businesses, including those to do with online transactions. The enforcement penalty for consumers in Kenya, the Act empowers the Competition Authority of Kenya to enforce consumer protection provisions, which violates can face penalties, fines, and imprisonment. We have seen Facebook being sued in Kenya, which is able to be sued in Kenya. We have seen a lot of fines for data protection from the Data Protection Commissioner. So there are a lot of protection of the consumers online. In Nigeria, we've also seen Consumer Protection Council in Nigeria is responsible for enforcing consumer protection regulations, and penalties can be imposed for violations. So there also protects their consumers. There is also enforcement and mechanisms. The same applies to South Africa, the same applies to Egypt. Data protection and privacy regulations. Kenya has the Data Protection Act in 2019, with also some regulations of 2021, and also Kenya has the Data Protection Commissioner, who actually has the power to enforce data protection in Kenya. And also in Nigeria has the Draft Acts, but they do have regulations known as the Nigeria Data Protection Regulation that regulates data protection in Nigeria. Also in South Africa, they have the Act, which goes by the name the Protection of Personal Information Act, which actually protects data protection both in online transactions. Egypt does not have comprehensive data protection legislation specified for online consumer data. However, the Egyptian constitution guarantees the right to privacy, and we hope Egypt will also follow other countries in drafting data protection regulations and also the acts.
Dixon, actually, let me just interject right there. And let us close on this last slide, just giving the perspective, and then allow Vellah and Jorge to take us through that last slide, because I think it's what's going to inform the conversation that we're having. So thank you for that presentation. And I think from it, we're able to see there's a lot of activity within the continent in terms of trying to have supportive blocks or features when it comes to taking care of the consumers, and then also just a move towards the digital economy and the digital environment. So some of the emerging concerns, I think, just off of Dixon's presentation, would be the conversation around privacy and security, which has come up a lot because of, one, the volumes of data that attach to engaging online. Then another situation that he has brought up is around the internet access and connectivity, where some people are still not able to interact or engage online due to either lack of internet or lack of being able to actually afford that particular service, which automatically then that means there are people who are exempt from this kind of services and therefore excluded. And I think thirdly, something that has come up is conversations just around the platform economy. You know, what does this mean engaging on particular marketplaces? You know, what does this mean in terms of, one, the information that you are getting, in terms of the terms of the contracts, of being able to, you know, get services or goods online, and then also just in terms of that element of competition. And I think at this point is where I'd like Vellah to chime in. So Vellah, you'd just be able to introduce yourself and the work that you focus on, and probably just share with us these emerging issues that are coming up as a result of online consumer action or protection. And I think particularly would be good to look at privacy and data protection, and then secondly, that element of competition.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Risper. So my name is Vellah Kigwiru. I'm a PhD student in a final year at the Technical University of Munich, in particular at the Hochschule für Politik, and also a guest researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition, and a researcher with UNCTAD and Economics Law, all those who know it. So my research mainly focuses on issues pertaining to the Global South, competition law, and consumer protection, trade, and many other areas. And this topic of today about consumer rights in the digital age, the number of issues I would like to touch on. And I think, Risper, you're asking a question about how consumer protection interacts with data protection law, cybersecurity, emerging technologies, and the issues relating to artificial intelligence. One thing we need to know that consumer protection and data protection, all of them share a common goal of addressing the imbalances of information and market power within the market ecosystem. And for consumers in the African context or in the Global South in general, they rely so much on an infrastructure that is established in the Global North. And one of the issues that they face, and which is very important for data protection, is how their data is used. Here we're talking about issues related to data sovereignty, data autonomy, the ability of the consumers to have a right on how their data is used by the digital platforms. Whether these digital platforms are leading platforms in Africa, like Take a Look in South Africa, or the one that Ogut has talked about in Egypt, or they're relying on Google to be able to access services or to access other platforms that are on the Google platform. So data for digital platform is very, very important. And that is why the Digital Market Act of the EU, which has just come into force, ensures that under Article 5.2 ABC, it ensures that when gatekeepers are using data, they're not able to process personal data, neither are they able to combine data that they get from their core platforms and those that they get from the third-party sellers. So for me, I understand that there's a very strong correlation between consumer protection and data protection law, and there's need for African countries and other stakeholders involved in consumer protection to ensure that the data that is collected from the consumers is protected. It's used when it's shared within borders. There's enough mechanisms in place to ensure that that data is not manipulated. And when you're talking about manipulation, it's not just about the misuse of data. We are also talking about algorithmic biasness that have been strengthened by colonial biases, in the sense that you find that some consumers pay higher prices in some regions than other regions. And also the questions of dispute mechanism. The Commercial Competition Commission in 2023 did an investigation against Jumia. And one of the issues that the Commercial Competition Commission found that is the question relating to liability. if a customer gets goods that are defective, who is liable on Jumia? Because most of these platforms, they act as intermediaries. So they provide a platform where sellers can sell their products. And if they don't have in place mechanisms that ensures that the sellers on their platforms are able to provide goods, they are able to make sure they've delivered them on time. And what if when a consumer pays for a good and that good, they never received that good, who is liable? And that is the question that the Commercial Competition Commission was asking Jumia, who is liable? Are you going to be liable for this? So the CCC asked Jumia to amend its term and condition and ensure that it gives information related to who is going to be liable. And another issue when we look at the participation of the sellers on the market, in 2020, when the COVID pandemic had just begun, the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Agency of Nigeria realized that some sellers on Jumia and hiked the prices of their goods to the detriment of the consumers, especially goods such as the masks, the sanitizers, and so on. And the Competition Authority was able to ask Jumia to delist all those sellers, more than 390 products that sellers had hiked their prices and had engaged in price gouging. So I would say that also when it comes to artificial intelligence, and I've talked about algorithmic bias, gender bias, the issue of entrenched colonialism when it comes to the marketplace, there's a need to ensure that when these platforms are using data or when the algorithms are trying to use data that try to set the prices of this product, and this has been very prevalent in the issue of digital lending, where the algorithms determines the interest and many things that really affect consumers. Unless I should give Jorge a chance and then I can revisit some of the issues again.
Yeah, I think that's okay. Yeah. But I think you've raised something really important, and particularly with the platform economy. The fact that it seems that they're serving a middleman role, and so there needs to be conversation around, how they actually engage in that space. I think that leads me to my question to Jorge, and I'll allow you to introduce yourself first, and then tackle that particular question where we are dealing with emerging tech, and we are now dealing with how consumers are interfacing with these technologies and how they're interacting online. So I think the first question would be, how is emerging tech, just based off your experience within the African context, how is it affecting how consumers trade or how they engage and interact?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to thank to you, Risper, to the Lawyers Hub, also in general, Vellah for being here and for inviting me to this panel. Thanks to Dixon also for the rich full content of the presentation. I think it's a great overview of the African context. And my name is Jorge Clarke. I work as an independent consultant in artificial intelligence, sustainable development, and innovation. I worked in Kenya for almost a year in this domain, and then I keep working with East African countries, always in this domain, artificial intelligence and innovation. Currently, I'm working for IRCAI, which is an International Research Center on Artificial Intelligence under the auspices of UNESCO, and partnering sometimes with the Lawyers Hub. My perspective is more from a technical point of view. From the regulatory aspect, Vellah has an incredible experience, and you also. But I think that it is absolutely necessary, just as an introduction, that these topics start to be discussed in a multidisciplinary way because if I go now to emerging technologies, the speed of changing, and we just felt that in this same room in the previous talk, in the previous panel, where the panelists were discussing about enhancing implants on human beings, which can be considered also as an emerging technology. So to go back to my point, the speed of change of technologies is getting faster and faster. And the speed of advance of regulation is far away from keeping the pace. I have the feeling that it is going a little bit faster with respect to itself, but there is this gap on the dynamic of regulation and the dynamic of technology, and this gap is increasing. So what might happen is that currently we will be regulating situations that will be obsolete in 2 or 3 years, because the technology overcome this situation and there are new anomalies or toxic dynamics that can emerge in the environment of digital markets and consumers. So if we think now specifically about emerging technologies, the first thing that comes to mind is artificial intelligence, but there are many other things under the table, anything related with Internet of Things, blockchain, drones that are used to deliver products or to track other type of information. And here is, again, I cross my ideas with what Vellah said about what is happening, like the first question, what is happening with this information, and are the current regulatory frameworks being effective? And then we move to the situation, the regulatory framework is in place, but then how much speed of action have, and it is capable of acting, because it is not enough with the regulatory framework to be there. It is also needed that this regulatory framework has how you would say speed and strong to act, to specifically to show to larger companies that we are surveilling and you cannot overcome certain rules. And here is my dilemma, again, from the technological point of view. How things are evolving is too fast. So from the consumer point of view in Africa and how they are dealing, this is also a subject that was touched in the previous panel. There is a big problem of education. And from my experience in East Africa in particular, is that suddenly consumers are starting to interact with platforms and services in a situation where it is a huge asymmetry of information, but huge in terms of education, awareness, and now I'm digging a little bit more in the digital gap and digital literacy skills. That the fact that many people can buy or rent a smartphone, search stuff there, use services, I don't know, like Uber or stuff like that, or access to services like Amazon or the other companies that were mentioned before, is not exactly correlated with having a minimum of digital literacy skills that would allow people to be aware of the risk associated with these interactions. So I end up here because this bring us to my original point of the strong need of a multidisciplinary approach, because we pass from emerging technologies, the speed of evolution of technologies, regulation, but we end up arriving to an issue of education. And this, I don't see too much discussion around changing radically the way we educate new citizens, including necessarily, especially when they are kids, because it's a very risky population, on digital literacy skills. So people can get close to take a rational decision and at least a first approach of a risk analysis on the potential risk that you face in this type of interchanges.
Actually, one of the conversations that was coming up early in the day was around use of tech by children. And I think it's coming up with, what you were saying. And one of the questions that was raised was, can we actually roll out technology that in and of itself is already child-friendly, as opposed to, what one of the panelists was saying, where they're having table settings with kids and trying to see how they interact with, say, privacy, and then begin to curate the products, or rather to customize the products again for the kids. So the question was, could we actually just have an initial rollout of technology or designs that are actually inherently child-friendly? And I think my question to you would be, even looking at, say, for instance, kids as consumers, what are some of the opportunities that lie for consumers, whether, in the different groups that they are in within the African context when we are talking about tech? And then I'll probably go to Vellah on regulation, just based off the
Could
things
you repeat
you've
the
raised.
question, please?
So what are some of the opportunities that are available to consumers in their different groupings? So whether it's children, whether it's women, whether, whatever category that they fall in, when it comes to emerging technologies, just even before, just at the point of rollout, what opportunities could be there to protect consumers?
Wow. Opportunities to protect consumers from a... It is, I was thinking in this, again, in the previous panel, and I have the impression that sooner or later, we will be needing to trust in artificial intelligence to create this regulation, just with the purpose of trying to create this regulation and adapt this regulation at the speed the technology is evolving. What opportunities could be for different groups of consumers? Well, there is always the opportunity of organizing. And this is a strong possibility for civil society organizations in particular. But again, we are working on the education issue. Civil society organizations could be a driver of organization to demand or push on the other side the providers, the sellers, the digital platforms, to have a responsible behavior, like to, if the technology is changing so fast that we need to rely a little bit on self-regulation in somehow. Self-regulation of the individual, but also self-regulation from the organization, from the companies. How can we push in this direction? Again, the opportunity that I see is civil society organizations that get together and push in this direction. It's not necessarily related with emerging technologies, but emerging technologies could be a mean to increase the speed of organization through, for example, civic tech initiatives. When we need to gather together the voice of, I don't know, many mothers of hundreds of thousands of children below 15 years, because they consider that they are having access to content that could be really harmful for them. How can these hundreds of thousands of mothers organize to get the weight and the power of being organized? This could happen through emerging technologies. This could be an example. Just to go back a little bit on history, think about 30 years ago when you go to cinema, there were movies that you were not allowed to see if you are younger than 14. Other movies you were not allowed to see if you're younger than 18, and so on and so on. And this was clear. And something similar should happen with all the content on the web and the way emerging technologies are being used to target this public. I imagine it is happening, but again, is this speed of regulate a technology to a moment when it is so close to this technology being obsolete and something else appears on the table. It's very challenging.
Yeah, quite. And I think as you're talking about regulation, we have currently the conversation around the AfCFTA, which is the Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement. And I think it's let me call it the hot topic now, yeah, and how it interfaces with whether it's the digital economy, whether it's digital transformation, whatever activities happening on the continent. And if you look at that document, it doesn't really raise, or rather fundamentally raise, consumer protection issues other than in the protocol for, say, trade in goods, which again only comes at the high level of the preambles, but it doesn't really go into the substantive text of that particular document. In comparison, just from my readings, I'm finding that the EU, what you call the Consumer Rights Directive is actually heralded as one of the most progressive consumer protection documents, in that it just tries to also regulate whether it's online marketplaces, whether it's how consumers are getting redress and how they're interacting with the particular digital spaces. So I think my question to you, Vellah, would be just from your interactions with regulation in Africa, and particularly when it comes to consumer protection or when it comes to competition, I'll use them together. Do you find that the existing regulations are actually addressing some of the issues that we have raised? So like privacy, Jorge has talked about digital literacy, the question that we talked about, inclusivity. Do you think our regulations are actually addressing these issues as they currently are?
Okay, thank you so much for that question. Just before I go on, I wanted to comment on the issue of child online safety. And I agree with my colleague that there's need for self-regulation, but there's also need for parents to play an active role on what platforms their children can access. And because like if you see the use of TikTok or Facebook and children are on Facebook and your child is on Facebook or TikTok, it's important for you as a parent to allow your child to access content that is useful, that is child-friendly, and so on. So to go back to the issue of whether the African regulatory framework is adequate, I would say that for the countries that have adopted consumer protection laws, or those that have competition laws that have consumer protection provisions, and those that have data protection laws, most of these laws have emulated what the EU has done to a large extent. So substantively, we have the laws and we have the sections that focus on consumer protection. The question is the implementation. Are the institutions that we have established adequate enough to protect the consumers from digital platforms? And you've talked about the FCFTA, and the FCFTA has a number of protocols, competition policy being one of them, investment being another one. But I'll speak about the FCFTA competition protocol. And it's amazing how the drafters of the first draft have included under the protocol, under Article 11, the question of regulating gatekeepers and ensuring that in cases whereby consumers or businesses have economic dependence on these gatekeepers, that these gatekeepers do not engage in practices that undermine the competitiveness of the market. So in this case, I would say that for the regulators, the ones who are implementing consumer protection laws, there's a number of issues they need to look at which are very peculiar to digital platform. One of them is the question of network effects, which has led to the lock-in of consumers on one platform as if there's no existence of other platforms. So you find that, for instance, because Uber was the first one to enter the Kenyan market or the African market, and Bolt, so consumers have been able to just use these platforms even when there are other platforms. And it's not their problem that they're using one platform, is because Uber and Bolt have been able to use the data that they have accumulated over time to ensure that these consumers are locked in on these platforms. And this speaks to the issue of inclusivity as our institutions look at the issues of consumer protection in e-commerce. Because if one platform is processing and combining data from all the other platforms, it means that other platforms which might have provided lower prices for the consumers are not even able to enter the market. So for our institutions, there's a need for them to look at the conduct that platforms engage in, taking into consideration the fact that the relationship between consumers and this platform is not equal. There's an equal market power dynamics. The consumers in Africa or in the global south are always, they always have a lower bargaining power. Therefore, they're susceptible to exploitative conduct from platforms. For instance, there's a time I was in Kenya, I ordered something and it was so hard to return it. Compared to EU, you have around 35 days and in some cases 60 days. If you received a product and you didn't like it, you just post it back free. You take it to DHL and you post it back and you get back your money. You don't need, if it was big and you didn't like it, you just post it back. And these are some of the benefits that consumers in the global south do not receive as compared to those in the global north. Another exploitative conduct that digital platforms may engage in is the question of consumer reviews. In most cases, we give reviews about businesses, but there are cases when reviews are given about consumers which are unfair, they're discriminatory in nature. And this kind of reviews, we've observed them on platforms like the Airbnb, whereby some hosts in developed countries will just give reviews about maybe the guests they hosted were Africans that are just discriminating. And another issue, and the one you raised about children, the regulatory framework should look about the issue of cultural diversity in the content that is being provided on various platforms. Because if a platform can be accessed everywhere and every country has its own cultures that govern engagement or what children can take in, there's need for also this institution to look at the issue of cultural diversity. And finally, because I see there's no time, there's this inquiry that the South African Competition Commission did about market online intermediation platforms. And the question of Google using its search engine to rank digital platforms in Africa was raised as a big concern that is affecting consumer rights, consumer choice, and prices that are being charged for consumers in the global south. For instance, you find that when you're searching for a flight or anything you're searching, so the first page of Google, even when you're searching for a flight from, let's say, Nairobi to South Africa, it will give you flights that are more expensive, maybe because those flights have been paid for, maybe it's KLM or Lufthansa or something else. But then it doesn't give the consumer the cheaper flights that they can buy. And in this case, you find that the consumers in this other section are paying more for services just because Google is giving preference to other digital platforms that are not on the continent. Thank you.
Wow. Yeah, the hurdles are quite something. And I think even just what you've talked about, and I think something that's resounding is that power dynamic or the lack of it anyway. I think the final question for me before I maybe open it up to anyone who'd want to comment or have a reaction or question would be, so now what do we do? The power dynamic is there, the power imbalance is there, and this is already, that's the situation that we are facing. So I think to you, Jorge, in terms of, just looking at the technical ambit of it, is there anything that can be done? And then to you, Vellah, in terms of any policy interventions, in terms of anything that you've spotted as you've gone through your work, is there really anything that can be done? Yeah. So we'll start with you, Jorge.
Well, from about what can be done, it still come to my mind a kind of a parallel between how things evolved in the global north occidental side. This data revolution, let's say it started in the 90s, and some years later appeared these services of like Google, for example, Gmail, everybody dreaming about having a lot of space, free Gmail. Nobody, maybe a few persons were questioning about what is this free service, what is happening behind this. And many years later, when the infrastructure is already mature, the level of penetration is over 70% in Europe and in the States, Canada, etc. Like the community, the society start realizing that, hey, they are using our data to many different things. And we don't know what they are doing with it, and they are using not only like the direct data. They discovered that using, there is a specific definition for this that I forgot, but all the available data, you can trace and predict so many things on consumer behavior. And let's imagine this between 2000 and 2015, where the GDPR reflections start to get crystallized, until 2018, when the GDPR is released. So we have a time window between, 15 to 20 years, with the difference of the digital infrastructures available already for mass consumption. which is not the case in Africa. In Africa, the digital infrastructure is still far away from this level. So there is still a couple of years to reach this maturity of digital infrastructure to have mass consumption. And somehow I think that this can buy the African continent some time to start working on the necessary regulation and pushing this regulation in advance, hopefully regulations that from the very beginning are flexible and dynamic and can quickly adapt to changes, which is hyper challenging. And so when the African continent reached this level of digital infrastructure maturity and the explosion of mass consumption will arrive, that I imagine this will be in 2030, maybe before, the stronger regulation and the robust regulation frameworks are already in place. But this puts on the table another discussion which is geopolitical and really delicate, that this infrastructure pass through the 5G network and 4G network, where you have basically like a war zone when the companies from China are starting to engage many contracts to build this network. And on the other side, you have the representatives from the United States to also build these networks. And we end up with the origin problem. Who own these networks will also have access to all this data. And what will they do with this data that is captured in the African continent and use it to build models in the global north? So what can we do now? I think encourage as much as possible multidisciplinary discussions to create actionable recommendations and try to build the best possible regulation to capture these changes, this speed, these quick changes in the technology. Focusing on the most vulnerable groups, I would suggest.
Interesting. Vellah?
On my side, and I agree with everything that has been said, I would say that there's need for advocacy. There's need for increased advocacy, and this can be done by civil societies and even social media influencers, just to educate the people about their consumer rights in the digital age, the issue to deal with the refunds and so on. And then because of the cross-border nature of these online transactions, there's need to have the regional economic communities and FCFTA and the African Union take the first step to push for consumer protection rights on the African continent. And then there's a need for institutional engagement. You see, in most countries, competition authorities enforce both competition and consumer protection. In other countries, it's just a consumer protection. And because of the relationship between consumer protection and data protection, then competition authorities, consumer protection authorities, data protection authorities have to work together as one if this has to happen. And then there's need to bring the digital markets to account for their behavior. They need to review the terms and conditions. They need to provide information about their liability because they're the ones that are hosting these businesses. There's need to look at the power imbalances between the gatekeeper who is providing the infrastructure for the sellers and look deeper into the contractual arrangements that these platforms have with the sellers. For instance, there was a complaint from one of my friends who was using Bolt to sell her products, or for Bolt to deliver products. And one day she just wakes up and her business is not part of Bolt. It has been delisted. And, you know, the more we have fewer players on the platform, it means that these players can decide what to price. And when they decide what to price, it means that this price is then incurred by the consumer, who then has to pay for this price at a higher rates. And more so, there's also the need for stakeholder engagement, both at the national and international level, the inclusion of institutions such as International Competition Network, SAID, the Federal Trade Commission, to take the first step in talking about consumer protection rights. And then finally, I'll think about having a conversation with the digital platforms, having a conversation with the sellers who operate on the digital platforms, and bringing to their attention the do's and the don'ts of their conduct, so that when they engage in this conduct, they're able to understand that we have consumers that need to benefit from this. They need quality goods, they need convenience, they need value, and it's that value we want to observe. Thank you.
Thanks, Vellah. I think I've taken a lot from this conversation, so thank you so much, Vellah and Jorge, and Dixon. Is there any response in the room, comments, questions?
Okay, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm a PhD candidate at the Free University of Brussels, or Vrije Universiteit Brussel. Thank you for this very interesting conversation, and also the PowerPoint given by the beginning from Dixon Ogugu. That was really interesting to see the whole, or not the whole, but at least a big part of the African regulatory framework. And make directly a link with this framework and also the issue of implementation. Because we've seen it a couple of times during this presentation that these gatekeepers have a monopoly over the data of users, and in particular, for this panel, consumers, and that they can do a lot of things, a lot of activities with this data, that they have, influencing electoral processes, for example, TikTok in Kenya last year, if I'm not mistaken. And this raises the question of a new phenomenon that threatens in particular the global south, and it's called digital colonialism. And I would like to hear your thoughts about this. Have you heard about this? What's your thought? And do you think we can say that there is a new form of colonialism, and in particular in the global south? Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Vellah? Does the answer sound like yes?
So, digital colonialism is all about knowledge production, yeah. We talk about knowledge production, and the fact that the platforms that we observe on the African continent are either the big US tech companies or the EU companies, or if we are having the African tech companies, then they're using the infrastructure that has been provided by the global north. So I've heard and I've read a lot about digital colonialism and how it has led to racial biasness, especially when it comes to the question of digital lending, whereby generally we'll find that consumers of digital lending who are mostly Africans who need money to sort one or two things, they're usually profiled as not able to pay, and this affects their access to credit. And in some cases, even, and it's so sad and unfortunate that we have some countries who use this kind of information that has been analyzed by algorithms that had been fed with data from different cultures, affecting a culture that did not participate in the production of that data to process visas. So the question of racial biasness that has been encapsulated by colonialism, which comes from the data input, is very, very crucial. And I think it's something that we need to talk about so that consumers in Africa or in India or in Latin America are not just receivers of these platforms. They also participate in the production and the input of data that these algorithms are being fed with.
Awesome. Jorge, any further comment on the same?
Just maybe just a few thoughts. Is that more for your question? Ask if we have felt it, or we agree. So from a very personal point of view, and I'm Chilean. I come from Chile, and I go back to my country every year for a month, plus the time that I lived in Kenya. Yes, for me it is a yes. It exists. It is happening to many different ways, and the crucial point again for me is that we start using tools that present beautiful advantages, but we are not prepared. And all these tools were built in a different country, with a different perspective, with a different culture, and with a purpose behind. And the purpose is, at the end of the day, in most of the cases, to have more consumers. So I think, yes, digital colonialism exists, and it is going on.
Okay, so because of time and because I think there's another panel coming on, I'm going to ask that we close it at this point. Some really interesting issues have been raised, and we do hope we can engage further in the discussion. We invite you for the Africa Law and Tech Festival in July, so make your way to Nairobi, Kenya. You'll have a good time, and we'll definitely interact a bit more on how we can now actively participate in these conversations and not just be receivers, as Vellah has alluded to. So thank you so much, Vellah. I'm so grateful. Thank you, Dixon, for all the remarks that you've shared. Thank you, Jorge. And thank you to all of you who've joined us for this particular discussion. Wishing you a great rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you guys in Nairobi in July.